Hi, Steve. Great to see you again, and thanks for giving us your time. I wanted to start first with you describing your experience at the moment of living in Thailand under COVID-19. How does life feel? Can you go out at all? Do you feel at risk? How is it?
It is amazing because it's a bit like being a person who's almost drowned. You now really appreciate the air because when we first arrived over here, the reason for coming here was because I was apoplectic about what I was seeing happening in both the UK and the Netherlands in the explosion of COVID cases over there. The situation we're in, a serious planetary overload, and with the breakdown of our biological systems produced soon followed by a breakdown of our economies, I blame it on neoclassical economics. Not only, but they certainly are major contributors to it all. I'm probably the person doing the most to expose the garbage, absolute sheer, unadulterated garbage that people like William Nordhaus and co have done on climate. I thought I'm going to be damned if I get killed as collateral damage. So that was the major motivation for moving to Thailand. When we arrived, Thailand was actually number 2 behind China in the number of cases when this thing first broke out. But as time went on, the numbers are getting worse for the Netherlands and the UK, absolutely horrifically worse. Already overtaking Thailand by that point, I thought we've got to get out of here and get somewhere where the virus is not growing as rapidly, and that was either Thailand or Australia, which are the two choices I had. We arrived one day before they started closing the border to tourists. We moved to a small town called Trang, which is about 800 kilometres, 500 miles south of Bangkok. At the time we arrived, there were 4 cases in Trang, the entire province. There are now 7. There hasn't been a new case here in about 6 weeks to 8 weeks, so we know the virus is not here. We all do all the mask stuff and the sanitising stuff anyway, but you have absolutely no tension now, no fear of your fellow human being. And that is, I'm sure, an absolute contrast with what life is like for you in the UK. The total number of cases in Thailand right now, I think, is 3,070. The daily increase in cases is below 10, and normally closer to 1 than it is to 10. And all those cases, bar 1 in the last 2 weeks, has come from people in quarantine. So Thai nationals returning home and being put in compulsory quarantine. None of this garbage about, lock yourself away and please catch the tube home if you feel like it. So Thailand will probably declare itself virus-free, I would say, in about a month's time. The only reason not to declare themselves virus-free is whether there are still Thai nationals returning home. So this is one of the countries that absolutely killed the virus.
Wow. So how come Thailand managed this? It seems to have done tons better than us.
Several reasons for that. When I got here, I saw what the Thais were doing in terms of being prepared for this sort of thing. Every day we were lining up outside a supermarket here to buy these packs. Now, one of these packs contains 4 masks. They are N95 masks, so the standard that actually blocks the virus. These cost the princely sum for the whole pack, 10 baht. Now, 10 baht is 25p. The whole idea of a shortage of personal protective equipment, forget it. Now, why have they got so many? Pardon, can I use French in your show? They fucking manufacture them themselves. And the manufacturer is actually making a 20% profit on these things. It's a government-controlled distribution system. They can't put more than that price on them, but they're still making a 20% profit per mask at that level. If you want to buy them in the UK, you can't buy them. They've got to be imported. We didn't have manufacturing capacity. So that was courtesy of us deindustrialising the West to take advantage of cheap wages in the third world, which I think is what actually happened with so-called globalization. It was basically exploiting cheap labour. But the third world countries that are doing this are exploiting the stupidness of Western manufacturers because they wanted Western technology in a hurry. Particularly China, of course, wanted that. So there's a huge technology transfer. They've got this manufacturing capability and they're ready to use it, and they can deploy it straight away. They can scale up and scale down as required. And so there was no shortage of personal protection equipment over here or in China or in South Korea or in Taiwan. They all had the masks they needed. So that alone stops the transmission of the disease. Then they had experience with SARS. They controlled the SARS outbreak. They weren't stupid enough to imagine this was just the sort of thing that a bunch of nerds in medical schools talk about. This is a real experience they've already had at least once with SARS. So they were prepared for it. They had a public health system. They could manufacture what they needed, and they've basically eliminated the virus. The more you overreact, the more sensible you are. And this is the mistake that the UK made. If you relax and let an exponential process get going, within a short while it is 100 or 1,000 times worse than it was before you could have acted. So you blew out to this enormous number of cases, and now you're saying, well, it's too late to track. The country that went in hard and fast have knocked it out completely. It's just taking an exponential process seriously. It's just realising how bad an exponential process can be and making policy decisions on that basis. Jacinta Ardern made a comment at one stage, we have 12 cases, but there were 12 cases in Italy 2 weeks ago. And so she realised you had to stamp on it very, very rapidly. She had cooperation from New Zealanders who accepted the need for a lockdown, and they've basically eliminated the virus now. So the main thing is taking the need to shut this down rapidly, seriously, and doing it as a public policy issue. That is number one. Number two is then public compliance with what you've said. So if you tell Americans that they've got to wear masks, they'll say, no, why should I wear a mask?
So what is really interesting, it seems, is that the world is being divided into countries that move fast and quashed it and will have no virus, and also populations fairly unexposed to virus, whereas other countries like the UK, US, probably India, will probably be living and coping with ongoing infections for a long time. So what are the implications economically, do you think, and politically due to that?
Politics plays a large part in it. It tends to be either progressive governments or authoritarian governments which have done it, in the sense that most of South Asia and China, obviously, you have an authoritarian government of some description. But those governments also are very responsive to what the public wants, because the public tends to riot and demonstrate if they don't get a decent standard of living out of those countries. So Thailand, you'd see as a sort of authoritarian democratic country. But there were, quite serious riots over the last couple of years over political divisions over wealth in the country. So they will complain if the situation doesn't work out well for the majority of the public. And frankly, that seems more responsive to what people actually want than the faux democratic systems of America and the UK.
Now the world's being divided between two spaces, one ongoingly infected and one space hardly affected at all. How do you think that's going to affect globalization, international political relations, and so on?
We have a really seriously divided world coming out of all this. And it's never a division that we've had before. The divisions we've had in terms of first world, third world, the West and the East, they've all been relatively geographical. This is partly geographical because it's mainly countries in the Asia-Pacific region that have been successful. But Norway is one of the countries that's been successful. So it's a very, very strange division of the world. I call it a fractured planet rather than a divided planet.
Presumably, the countries having continuous disruption by the pandemic, that'll affect their ability to economically. The US is obviously a huge provider of demand to the rest of the world, and that will be cut off or substantially reduced. Do you think that will mean that the Asian area, for instance, will really seek to ramp up local demand and change the nature of their economies?
Very much so. This is the thing that's at the end of globalization. I mean, globalization basically said it's best to be a big globule of matter, no borders, free movement anywhere, and that's basically saying to a virus, hey, come along and invade every last human on the planet. It's thinking in a whiteboard economic way rather than a biological way. If you wanted to be ready to fight biological infections, you would never have had a globalized economy. You would have had regionalized. So an outbreak in one region would not affect another region. But instead we made it totally globalized, and that exposed us to a biological attack, which is what this is fundamentally. And the impact is so great, I think no country that manages to avoid the virus will ever consider going back to globalization once more. So they're going to say, okay, we can't rely upon globalized demand or supply.
Isn't there a slight difference between the movement of goods and services and the movement of people? Because surely the spread of the virus was through people traveling, whereas goods don't take the virus with them.
I have yet to see a parcel sail itself to America. There are people on ships. You have to have sailors. You have to hop inside a confined space and spend 3 to 5 weeks travelling from one spot to another. They are going to have to be in quarantine for 2 to 3 weeks before they hop inside the boat, minimum. as a crew. They've got to be isolated from each other and isolated from their families. To be really serious about it, a 3-week complete quarantine before your crew hops on the boat. And of course, you've got to pay them for that quarantine period. The whole idea of ships of convenience, the flags of convenience that have reduced the cost of international shipping, that's gone. The whole pattern of global trade is being disrupted by this. The costs of globalised trade, where we tend to ignore the cost of transporting goods and ignore the fact that there's time delays and all that sort of stuff in there. The time delays are going to blow out by a factor of at least 2 to 4 weeks in each shipping. The costs are going to blow out because you're going to pay longer for the workers on board the boats. Even on a sheer cost of doing it scale, it completely overturns the globalised production chain and says you're better off doing it domestically. I have a lot of respect for the Thai bureaucracy, and certainly how they've handled the COVID has been superb. I'm sure that there are people inside the government now saying, well, we can't rely upon American tourists. How do we increase tourism from elsewhere? What other systems can we use? We can't rely upon exporting stuff to America anymore. So they'll be making the decision saying, well, we have to boost domestic demand. How do we do it? And I've got a feeling in that sense, this is the beginning of realising what is an MMT approach initially, to create localised demand while chucking out the nonsense idea about international trade that MMT has about exports being a cost and imports being a benefit. Exports and imports, I think, are gone in that sense. It's going to be as much as possible domestic production and regional cooperation.
What do you think that all means for climate change and COP26 next year?
I hope that people realise the seriousness of global warming and climate change courtesy of coronavirus, because this to me is a dress rehearsal. Of course, the Spanish flu was the classic example of a previous pandemic. Pandemics are made more likely by the pressure we're putting on the planet as a species. And that pressure is increased many-fold over the time of the Spanish flu. We are going to see many, many more climate crises like this. Look at 2020 so far. Fires in Australia, floods in Australia as well, the virus, floods in India, and now locust plagues in Africa and Asia. And we're going to be following up with wildfires in California. It's classic, it's actually 2020 this is happening, because we all talk about 2020 hindsight. Seeing what we're seeing in 2020, if we'd known this was coming in 2010, we would have behaved a damn sight differently. And I think in that sense, it's a wake-up call for all these sort of meetings. But I still think it's too early for any of these decision-making bodies to really change direction. They're still going to be trying to achieve green growth, which I think is an oxymoron.
I hope this message does get across and we see some new thinking in the recovery. But thank you very much, Steve, for joining us from Thailand. I look forward to talking to you again soon and seeing how policy really does change, maybe away from globalization. That will be fascinating.